"You're not indispensable, Linda. Especially not now." That was the first thing he ever said to me. Not "welcome back," not "glad you made it through," not even a handshake. Just that flat, cold, and delivered without a flicker of hesitation. For a second, I thought I misheard him. But he repeated it, slower this time, like he was testing whether I was lucid enough to understand that my value after nearly 2 decades of loyalty had quietly expired while I was gone. I smiled. Just a small, composed smile. Then I walked out of his office like someone who had finally seen something clearly, something undeniable. His name was Richard Kane, the newly appointed CEO of Landon Rowe, a mid-sized financial firm based in St. Louis. And I had been the director of human resources there for 18 years, long enough to know every dysfunction we'd buried under process, every fragile ego we'd shielded from the truth, and every fire I had quietly put out before it reached legal. But I wasn't flashy. I didn't climb ladders for the sake of the title. I didn't speak just to be heard. I simply held the company together from behind the scenes during the 2008 recession, the post-COVID restructurings, the quiet crises no one talked about. I was the backbone they never acknowledged until it started to show signs of fatigue. You see, I had just returned to work after 6 months of medical leave, ovarian cancer, stage 2. The kind of battle that strips you to the bone, not just physically but existentially. Coming back wasn't just a choice, it was a declaration that I was still standing. But what awaited me wasn't a warm return. It was a recalibration. Richard wasn't one of us. He didn't come up through the ranks. He came from connections, a failed consultant with 2 collapsed startups and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. In his first week, he laid off 5 department heads by email, renamed the conference rooms with buzzwords like velocity and disruptor, and told people handshakes were outdated. And then, quietly, he scheduled a one-on-one meeting with me. I was prepared, notes in hand, blazer pressed. I intended to walk him through our team's strengths and upcoming goals. Instead, I got a spreadsheet and a sentence. Starting next pay cycle, your salary will be reduced by 30%. You're overcompensated for what you do. I could have protested. I could have reminded him of the legal disputes I'd resolved, the turnover rates I had reversed, the cultural fractures I had mended while undergoing chemo. But I didn't, because in that moment, something in his posture, his voice, his complete disregard, told me this wasn't personal. It was worse, it was impersonal. To him, I wasn't a person. I was overhead, a relic. An older woman in her late 50s, recovering from cancer, not loud, not trendy, not part of his vision. He thought I was someone he could erase quietly and efficiently. And that's when I knew. He believed he had broken me. But what he had actually done was set me free. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even tell a soul. I simply walked to the nearest restroom, locked the door, stared at my reflection, and smiled. Not the smile of someone defeated, but of someone who had just been given permission to stop protecting people who no longer deserved it. That day, I realized something dangerous. A woman like me, with nothing left to lose, doesn't disappear. She watches, she remembers, and eventually, she rebuilds. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't frown or sigh. In fact, he barely looked at me. Richard Kane kept his eyes fixed on the glowing spreadsheet in front of him, scrolling as though I were nothing more than another row to be reviewed, another cost column to be trimmed. Then, with the cold efficiency of someone confirming a lunch reservation, he said, "Starting next month, your salary will be reduced by 30%. Just like that. No explanation. No conversation. Not even a moment of human acknowledgement. I sat still, unsure if I had heard him correctly or if my post-treatment fatigue had blurred the line between reality and absurdity. But the silence that followed, uncomfortable and intentional, made it clear he wasn't joking. Nor did he feel he needed to justify his decision. I remember the gentle hum of the HVAC unit, the faint clicking of his keyboard, and the sterile scent of that redesigned executive floor, so new, so impersonal, so very unlike the company I had once helped shape. "Linda, you've been here a long time," he added, still not making eye contact. "And with legacy tenure comes legacy compensation. We're shifting toward a more performance-based structure, now leaner, more modern." The way he said it, you'd think I was a relic of some outdated era, a footnote in a manual nobody read anymore. You understand, he said finally, as if I had a choice. And in that moment, something inside me went quiet. Not broken, not bitter, just quiet. I could have responded with numbers, retention rates, cost-saving initiatives I'd implemented, the lawsuits I prevented by stepping in before legal was even needed. I could have shown him the binder I'd brought to the meeting, filled with performance metrics, culture benchmarks, and a succession plan I had spent 3 months building, even while undergoing chemo. But I didn't open it. I didn't say a word, because what I realized, as he dismissed me with corporate poetry about agility and innovation, was far more powerful than anything I could have said. Richard Kane didn't see me. He didn't see the 18 years of grit it took to hold that company together through 2 recessions, a merger, and a global health crisis. He didn't see the nights I stayed past midnight counseling employees through divorce, grief, or burnout, or the mornings I arrived early to prepare for layoffs I hadn't chosen but still had to make humane. No, what he saw was a woman in her late 50s, recently off medical leave, no longer shiny or marketable, no longer useful in his world of tech speak and trimmed overhead. He saw a cost, a liability, an aging presence, in a place he wanted to fill with echo chambers and glass walls. And that more than the salary cut, more than the dismissiveness was the deepest wound. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was familiar. Because every woman I had ever mentored, every colleague I had ever comforted after their own quiet dismissal had seen this look before, the look that says, "You've had your turn. It's someone else's time now." And what they really mean is, "You no longer matter." But I did not let him see my anger. I didn't let the insult show. I simply straightened my posture, placed the binder gently back into my bag, and said with the calm of someone who'd already survived far worse, "Understood." I stood and left, heels tapping softly against the polished marble floors he had imported from Italy, part of his image overhaul, meant to reflect progress and prestige. I passed the new abstract artwork in the lobby, the smart glass doors that changed tint with the light, and the reception desk now staffed with interns half my age wearing matching navy suits. But I wasn't humiliated. Not yet. That would come later, and it would come with precision. Because Richard Kane had made 2 fatal assumptions. First, that I wouldn't fight. Second, that I had no more moves left. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't begin to imagine, was that while he'd spent the last few weeks redesigning job titles and restructuring hierarchies, I had spent the last few decades building the very systems that made those titles and hierarchies work. He thought cutting my salary would shrink me into silence. What he gave me was clarity. And once clarity settles in the heart of someone who's already stared death in the face, someone who's clawed her way back to life with nothing but painkillers and willpower, you don't get passivity, you get purpose. He thought I was overpaid. He had no idea how costly that sentence would become. It's strange how easily some people forget the foundations beneath their feet though quickly. They overlook the hands that held things together while everyone else was too busy chasing titles or polishing their LinkedIn headline. But I remember, because I was there every single year, through every quiet crisis that never made it into the quarterly reports. 18 years at Landon Row wasn't just a career. It was a lifetime spent weaving invisible threads that kept the whole place from unraveling. And most days, no one even noticed. I joined the company long before sleek renovations and executive rebrands, back when the break room smelled like burnt coffee and the HR software was more glitch than guided. I wasn't hired to lead. I was hired to fix, to stabilize, to listen when no one else wanted to hear the hard truth, and to speak when no one else knew how. Over the years, I became the one they called when someone quit without notice, when a manager crossed the line, or when 2 departments were on the brink of silent war. I didn't chase visibility or credit because I knew that real power often lives behind closed doors, and that the work that truly matters is usually the work no one applauds. During the recession of 2008, while other departments were cutting staff with a scalpel, I restructured entire divisions with precision and empathy, saving jobs not through spreadsheets but by knowing who could be retrained, who was supporting a sick spouse, and who simply needed a little time to catch up. I implemented a retention model that dropped turnover by 40% in less than 2 years, not by offering beanbags and pizza Fridays, but by fixing broken processes and giving people a reason to stay. Long before diversity initiatives became buzzwords for branding decks, I was the one building pipelines for underrepresented voices, not to check boxes, but because I knew what it felt like to be overlooked and underestimated. I trained executives who now pretend not to remember where they started. I coached managers through layoffs and leadership crises. I was the one people came to in whispers, in tears, in frustration, because they knew I'd listen, not just respond. I walked newly promoted VPs through their first disciplinary meetings, rewrote entire policy handbooks late into the night, and created a conflict resolution protocol so effective it was later shared with 2 sister companies. And still, I never asked for a plaque, a bonus, or a spotlight. My satisfaction came from knowing the wheels kept turning because I was quietly keeping the gears aligned. But the truth is, I wasn't just giving to a company, I was giving to people. I knew the names of their spouses, their kids, their favorite songs at company karaoke. I remembered birthdays others forgot and followed up on surgeries, adoptions, and aging parents. I held hands in hospital waiting rooms and organized funeral donations when tragedy struck. I was more than HR. I was human, and I showed up like it mattered because to me, it did. Even when cancer came knocking, I didn't let go. I worked remote from chemo chairs, answered urgent emails between scans, and left detailed handover memos before every treatment session in case I couldn't make it through the week. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I knew how fragile the system was, how easily people fall through the cracks when the wrong person disappears at the wrong time. I wasn't trying to be a martyr. I just knew that when the scaffolding is pulled away without warning, entire structures collapse and, more often than not, it's the most vulnerable who get crushed first. So I stayed, I held it up, and when I finally came back after treatment, thinner, paler, but still standing, I believed naively, perhaps that the years I gave, the things I held together, would still mean something. But in Richard's eyes, none of it mattered. Not the crises I had carried them through. Not the quiet wins. Not even the months I worked while fighting for my life. To him, I was just old. Too familiar, too expensive, too quiet to be seen. And yet, what he didn't realize, what none of them did, really is that my silence wasn't absence. It was preparation. Because people like me don't just disappear. We evolve. We remember. And when the time comes, we rise not in anger but with purpose. I like to say the salary cut was the worst of it, that once I accepted it with grace and walked away with my dignity intact, the storm passed. But storms don't always come loud and fast. Some creep in quietly, shifting furniture 1 inch at a time until the space around you becomes unfamiliar. Until you wake up one morning and realize you're not where you used to, but not physically, not professionally, not even personally. It began with my office. One afternoon, after a routine lunch break, I returned to find a young woman seated at my desk, where 18 years of decisions, strategies, and late-night crisis calls had unfolded. She was typing confidently, her posture loose, like she belonged. There was no nameplate, no note, no explanation, just her. When I asked what she was doing there, she looked up with a polished smile and said, "Oh, didn't they tell you? I'm Mr. Kane's new executive coordinator. He asked me to sit closer to his office." I stood there for a moment, not out of confusion, but to anchor myself against the surreal cruelty of it all. Then, without a word, I packed my things, photos of my daughters, a ceramic mug from my first manager, the little stapler I'd kept since the early days, and moved to the only open desk they offered me. One shoved into a corner next to the copier, beneath a flickering light and a vent that clanged every time the heat kicked in. No announcement, no transition, no acknowledgement that I had just been quietly displaced from the space I had helped build into a functioning department. But that wasn't the end. Soon after, I noticed my calendarons filled with high-level planning meetings and executive roundtable had been stripped bare. The recurring meetings I'd led for years simply vanished, with no notes, no cancellations, just gone. I wasn't informed, I wasn't asked, they just stopped inviting me. In their place appeared generic HR help desk tasks, administrative overflow, and requests to review onboarding manuals, tasks I hadn't done since the early 2000s. Meanwhile, the young woman, her name was Madison, began shadowing me under the pretense of learning the ropes. She asked questions that didn't align with understanding policy, but hinted at something else: access. visibility surveillance, I soon noticed she had been granted view-only access to our HR database, payroll systems, and employee files levels of clearance not typically extended to someone in a non-HR role. I didn't raise alarms, not immediately, because I understood what was happening, and I knew I couldn't afford to flinch. She began calling me Lindy in front of the interns, a name I hadn't used since high school, as if familiarity could be weaponized to subtly undermine my authority. She made offhand comments about how things must have been done so differently back then, as if the systems she now used didn't exist because I had once designed them from scratch. I watched as she took screenshots of documents she barely understood, forwarded sensitive files without checking context, and nodded along in meetings where her silence was mistaken for insight. It would have been easy to feel humiliated, and at moments I did, but I didn't fight it, not yet, because I wasn't retreating, I was observing. While they dismissed me as a relic, I became something far more dangerous, invisible, and in invisibility, I found freedom. Every morning, I arrived 15 minutes early. Every evening, I stayed 20 minutes late. I began quietly downloading internal policies, archiving contracts I had once approved, and backing up communication logs I had authored. I studied the audit trail of permission changes in our systems, documented who had access to what and when and how. I reviewed files Madison had touched, checked metadata for signs of tampering, and took notes, careful, thorough, undeniable notes. They thought I was idle, I was precise, they assumed I was done. I was preparing. No one questioned me, because in their minds, I had already been erased, moved aside, minimized, benign, and that was their second and far more dangerous mistake. Because what they didn't understand is that I had built every failsafe, every system dependency, every quiet redundancy that kept the company's human core intact. And if you pull away the person who understands the hidden stitching without learning how to sew it back together, things don't just unravel, they collapse. So I let them ignore me. I let them assume the damage was done. Because in the silence of being sidelined, I was building something they didn't even realize existed. And when the time came, they wouldn't hear the explosion. They would feel the absence. There's a moment quiet, fleeting, when you realize no one is coming to defend you. Not because they don't care, but because they're afraid. Afraid of losing their place, of drawing attention, of being next. I saw it in their eyes every time they passed me in the hallway, glanced at my new desk near the copier, and then quickly looked away. People I had supported through promotions, marriages, miscarriages, and breakdowns suddenly found the floor more interesting than my face. But I didn't blame them. The truth is, I understood their silence better than I wished I did. What I didn't understand and would never accept was the assumption that I would disappear quietly, that I'd take the humiliation, the demotion, the slow erasure of my authority, and fade into the background like a piece of outdated software they could uninstall without consequence. That wasn't going to happen. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to let my story end at the hands of someone who hadn't earned the right to hold a pen. I didn't make speeches. I didn't throw files or slam doors. Instead, I got to work. Every system Landon Rowe ran through HR, from payroll permissions to employee contracts to leadership assessments, had been built, refined, or touched by me at some point. I had designed redundancies, risk alerts, and escalation protocols not for power, but for protection of people, of values, of the company itself. But now, those same systems would become the quiet architecture of accountability, not in a way that would hurt anyone, but in a way that would reveal everything. Each night, after the halls emptied and the overhead lights dimmed to maintenance mode, I stayed. I combed through policy archives, checking for unauthorized changes. I reviewed access logs, noting each time Madison or one of the junior analysts entered restricted files they weren't trained to interpret. I copied records not to expose secrets, but to ensure there was a record of the truth, unfiltered and uncorrupted. I built a timeline, mapped inconsistencies, flagged risk clusters. No one noticed. They thought I was stuck in administrative exile, too outdated to understand the new direction. And all the while, I wore their dismissal like armor. What they didn't realize is that cancer had already taken everything from me once my energy, my confidence, my hair, my illusion of control, and I had survived. Not because I was fearless, but because I had learned the power of choosing where to place my fight. And this was a battle worth fighting, not for position or pride, but for the principle that no one should be discarded after giving everything they had. So I began preparing something no one saw coming. A safeguard, a contingency plan, a quiet signal flare for when the systems they took for granted started blinking red. I created layered backups, isolated administrative triggers, and restructured a dormant emergency response protocol I had written years ago, initially intended for cyber attacks or natural disasters. Back then, it was theoretical insurance we hoped we'd never use, but now it was a living fuse, waiting. Each step I took was deliberate, not to destroy, but to protect, not to retaliate, but to preserve. Because the difference between revenge and restoration is where you stand when the dust settles. I didn't want to burn the place down. I wanted them to realize who had been holding the beams up all along. I kept my tone calm in meetings. I answered questions thoroughly, even when I was spoken over or dismissed mid-sentence. I watched as junior staff, encouraged by Madison's cheerleading, began treating me like a fossil instead of a force. But I didn't flinch. I didn't correct them. I just noted, quietly, what would happen when their shortcuts collided with the realities I had once spent years safeguarding them from. They thought they were watching me fade, but I was watching something else entirely. The slow shift in atmosphere, the way cracks had begun forming beneath the surface, subtle but growing compliance violations, mismatched onboarding documents, incomplete audit trails, duplicated credentials, left open too long. I didn't cause them. I simply stopped catching them. And soon, the company would begin to feel the difference between having someone who cleaned the mess before it spread and losing the person who knew how the wires were held together. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just had to stop whispering solutions into the ears of people who had stopped listening. And so, I waited. Not with bitterness, but with quiet confidence. Because when you've already rebuilt yourself after being broken, watching something else fall apart without your help feels less like vengeance and more like gravity doing its job. It was a Tuesday morning, unseasonably gray for early spring in St. Louis, with the kind of damp chill that seeps into your clothes and makes everything feel heavier than it should. I remember noticing how the trees outside the building looked like they were holding their breath, just as I was holding mine. There was no agenda on the calendar, no subject line that gave anything away, just an all-hands meeting scheduled in the main conference room, mandatory attendance. We had those meetings maybe once a quarter, usually to announce promotions, major changes, or company wins. But this one was different from the start. The tone in the email was too neutral, too careful. And when I walked into the room and saw Richard Kane already standing at the head of the long glass table, sleeves rolled, smile practiced, posture rehearsed, I knew this wasn't an update. It was an execution. Madison stood to his right, tablet in hand, tapping and scrolling like she was confirming a seating chart for a dinner no one wanted to attend. She glanced at me not with cruelty, but with detachment, like she was watching someone about to be archived. I took my seat, folded my hands, and waited. "Thank you all for being here," Richard began, his voice smooth with that corporate glaze that sounds polished until you realize it's empty. "Over the past few months, we've been conducting a comprehensive review of internal operations, looking at structure, alignment, and overall strategic fit moving forward." He paused, scanning the room as if to signal gravitas, but really, it was theater. And when his eyes landed on me, even for that brief flicker of a second, I felt the shift not just in the room, but in my chest. He didn't need to say my name. Everyone already knew. "As a result of this review," he continued, "we've identified several roles that are no longer aligned with the company's evolving direction, roles that have served us well in the past but are now considered outdated in scope." That word again, outdated. Not ineffective, not underperforming, just obsolete. He didn't turn to me. He didn't invite me to speak. He didn't offer a handshake or a card or a single word of thanks. Instead, he looked straight ahead and said, "This will be Linda Walker's final week with the company. We thank her for her years of service and wish her the best in her future endeavors." And that was it. No applause, no acknowledgement, no closure, The silence that followed was deafening, not the respectful kind, but the suffocating kind that fills a room when people are too afraid to move, too ashamed to meet your eyes. I looked around at the faces I had once mentored, supported, defended, people I had covered for when they made mistakes, people I had fought for during compensation reviews, people I had stayed late with during their darkest personal storms. Not one of them said a word. Some looked at their notepads, others at their shoes. A few offered half-hearted smiles that died halfway to their lips. And in that moment, I realized that my presents me, years of work, my legacy, was being erased in real time, one awkward silence at a time. But strangely, I didn't feel angry. I felt free. Because when you've given everything to a place and they still choose to let you go without grace, it means you don't owe them anything anymore. Not your silence, not your loyalty, not your protection. So I stood. I didn't cry. I didn't falter. I simply stood, nodded once, and said, "It's been a privilege." And then I turned and walked out heels, echoing against the tile like a drum beat marking the end of a war I hadn't realized I'd been fighting for years. I made it to the stairwell before the tears came, not because I was broken, but because something inside me had finally snapped into place. It wasn't grief, it was clarity. 19 years of dedication, 19 years of loyalty, 19 years of making sure the company didn't just function, but held its people together like a family. And it had all been dismissed in 5 sentences, delivered without emotion by a man who had never taken the time to understand what I did. But here's what Richard didn't know. That walk down the hallway wasn't just me leaving the building. It was me leaving behind the part of myself that stayed silent in the face of injustice. The part that clung to the hope that integrity would be enough. And what stepped out into the cold gray air that morning wasn't a woman defeated. It was a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. He thought he was closing a chapter. He didn't realize I was just beginning to write the next one. The world didn't change overnight, and neither did I. But something had shifted, a quiet resolve, a clarity that no longer needed approval or applause. I had walked out of Landon Row with nothing but a cardboard box and my name stripped from every meeting invite, but I still carried something far more powerful, the blueprint of a system I had once built to protect them, and the knowledge of exactly how to undo it. They thought I would fade. What they didn't understand was that people like me don't vanish, we reposition. 3 nights after the announcement, I sat at my dining table, surrounded by old journals, backup drives, and a mug of chamomile tea that had long gone cold. The emergency protocol I'd once created in the event of a catastrophic breach of hypothetical system failsafe meant to be triggered only if leadership collapse was still intact. No one had ever needed it. No one had even reviewed it in years. But I had kept my private access key, encrypted and buried deep in a personal archive, never once thinking I'd be the one to use it. Until now. At exactly 9:14 p.m., I activated the dormant sequence sonat with the intent to cause damage, but to begin the quiet unraveling of a structure that no longer honored the principles it was built on. It was a soft extraction, surgical and legal, severing my administrative links from the internal frameworks without leaving behind a single broken line of code. Every credential I had granted, every system I had structured, every conditional access that bore my digital signature, recalled, revoked, retracted. And in that act, I wasn't tearing anything down. I was simply stepping out and letting gravity do the rest. By morning, the first signs of instability began to surface. Payroll access failed to authenticate. The compliance dashboard, once accessible at the click of a button, now looped into a 403 error page. HR's internal ticketing system, something I'd built from scratch after 3 failed vendor contracts, redirected to a blank screen. For anyone else, these would have looked like glitches, maybe bugs, but for those who had been paying attention, they were signals. The net had been pulled. And then came the calls. Not to me, of course, they didn't even know where to reach me anymore, but to each other. 5, 10, 15 messages in the first hour. Questions turned to panic. Audit trails vanished. Benefit renewals stalled mid-process. Metadata logs couldn't be traced. The foundation wasn't crumbling yet, had been gently removed. Meanwhile, I remained calm because I wasn't alone. Months before Richard Kane had ever stepped foot into Landon Row, I had been approached quietly by another firm, Ashcroft Bray, a mid-sized consultancy based out of Denver with a people-first reputation and a culture that reminded me of what Landon used to be before the branding took over the heart. They had followed my work, admired it from a distance, and invited me to join their transformation initiative. At the time, I declined out of loyalty, but loyalty, once betrayed, becomes clarity. When I reached back out, they didn't hesitate. Within a week, I was onboarded as Chief Talent Strategist, not in title alone, but in full capacity. And I didn't come alone. I brought with me the systems I had architected, the insights I had refined through 2 decades of hands-on leadership, and the people who had always been overlooked in favor of louder voices. Those who had watched me get pushed aside in silence began trickling in, one by one, carrying nothing but their experience and the quiet confidence that this time, their work would be seen. Ashcroft. Bray didn't just absorb us, they amplified us. And when Sterling Capital Partners announced they were divesting underperforming divisions across the Midwest, including Landon, Rose R, D Unit, Ashcroft moved quickly. On paper, it was a strategic acquisition. Behind the scenes, it was poetic symmetry. Weeks later, I stood once again in a conference room, this time with the morning sun pouring through tall windows, and with me at the head of the table leading the integration between Ashcroft and the very division that had once dismissed my worth. When Richard walked in, clearly unaware of who would be guiding the transition, the room went still. He paused at the door, blinking like he'd stepped into a memory he had buried too shallow. I didn't flinch. I extended my hand and said, "Welcome to our transition alignment meeting, Mr. Kane. I trust you've reviewed the materials in advance." He tried to speak. He couldn't. Not a word. Just a nod, a tightened jaw, and the quiet resignation of a man who finally realized the mistake he had made, not because he lost his power, but because he never understood where the real power had been all along. Angela Madison's replacement, I later learned, was no longer with the company. A compliance breach had surfaced around the time access logs were being audited. Unfortunate timing, or perhaps inevitable, given how carelessly shortcuts are exposed when the person who used to catch them is no longer there. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice or demand acknowledgement. I simply led the meeting, answered questions, clarified timelines, and concluded with the same steadiness I had always brought to my work. But now, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't fighting to be heard. I was the one people turned to for direction, and not because they had to, but because they trusted me to lead. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who once cut my salary and dismissed my legacy now sat in silent participation at a table I controlled, following the agenda I had written, listening to decisions shaped by the very strategy he had once called obsolete. It wasn't revenge. It was justice measured, legal, and undeniable. And it was only the beginning. I didn't return with fanfare. There was no press release, no dramatic reveal, no headline declaring that the woman once deemed too expensive had become the architect of a turnaround. That was never the point. I had no interest in parading my comeback for applause or recognition, because what I was building now didn't require validation, it required vision. At Ashcroft Bray, I wasn't handed a title for show. I was given space, authority, and above all, respect. And not just for what I had endured, but for what I had learned through it, lessons earned not in executive seminars or weekend retreats, but in hospital beds, boardrooms, and long, lonely walks to parking lots after being dismissed by people who didn't even know what I carried. What we built over the following months wasn't simply an HR operation or a recruitment model. It was a culture born from shared experiences of those who had been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside. The people who came with me, some quietly, others defiantly, weren't just employees looking for a second chance. They were seasoned professionals, many over 50, who had once been labeled past their prime by companies too focused on youth to see the value of wisdom. At Ashcroft, they weren't relics. They were architects. And together, we didn't rebuild, we redefined. Every system I had once created at Landon Row, I revisited not to replicate, but to refine, removing the compromises I had made under pressure, rewriting the policies I had once softened to keep executives comfortable. This time, I didn't need to tiptoe around ego or pretend to agree with shallow initiatives dressed up as innovation. This time, I built without fear of being erased. The transformation was quiet, but undeniable. Employee turnover dropped within the first quarter. Exit interviews became exit thank yous. Departments that had been siloed for years began collaborating again, not because we forced alignment, but because we created belonging. And perhaps the most telling change wasn't in metrics or reports, but in posture. People stopped shrinking into themselves. They stopped bracing for impact. They started speaking up, taking risks, and trusting that if they fell, someone would be there not to punish but to help them rise. And I finally exhaled. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing either. I wasn't looking over my shoulder or calculating how to survive the next pivot. I was rooted, grounded in a place that didn't just recognize my presence but respected my process. And in that stillness, something began to bloom inside me that I had forgotten I even planted, hope not just for myself, but for those who had never been allowed to take root in the first place. So I began mentoring, not the usual corporate mentorship where names are matched for optics and never followed up, but real, intentional, face-to-face guidance. I opened office hours not for executives, but for assistants returning after caregiving breaks, for interns who had been told they didn't look the part, for mid-career professionals who had been quietly pushed out of promotion pipelines and left to question if they still had something to offer. That was where I poured my energy, not into punishment or poetic justice, but into prevention. If I could make sure even one woman never had to sit through the kind of dismissal I had, if I could help one man over 55 feel seen in a world trying to forget him, then none of it had been in vain. Out of that intention came something I never planned but always needed. Second, bloom a leadership initiative for women over 40 who had been labeled too late or too quiet or too much. The first cohort filled within days. The second had a wait list. And with each session, I watched people unlearn shame and rediscover power not through bravado, but through belonging. One afternoon, a junior analyst I'd never worked with slipped a handwritten note under my office door. It said simply, "Thank you for proving that quiet isn't weak, that experience doesn't expire, and that some of us are just getting started." I read it twice before folding it carefully into my notebook. Not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me of every silent moment I had endured, every overlooked idea, every seat I'd been denied. And it confirmed what I had come to understand deep in my bones. This wasn't revenge. This was resurrection. A rising not fueled by rage, but by clarity. What I had reclaimed wasn't a title. It was my voice. And now I was using it to lift others. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Quiet, unremarkable. The kind of day that would slip by unnoticed if not for what it held. I was walking down the second floor hallway of Ashcroft Dubray's headquarters, reviewing notes from our latest team debrief, when I passed the break room and saw him standing there, alone, staring into the hum of the coffee machine as though he didn't quite remember how it worked. Richard Kane. He looked smaller somehow, his posture curved inward, his once polished presence dulled like a photograph left too long in the sun. The crisp edges of confidence had frayed, and the absence of urgency in his stance told me everything I needed to know he wasn't running anything anymore. He turned as I passed, his eyes catching mine with the hesitation of someone not sure whether they were allowed to speak. "Linda," he said, barely above a whisper, as if saying my name too loudly might summon the truth he had spent so long avoiding. "Can we talk?" I paused, not out of malice, but because I wanted to be sure I was ready. And I was. "Of course," I replied. We stepped into a small, side office-neutral territory. No windows, no desk between us, just two people, finally stripped of performance and pretense. He didn't sit. He leaned forward, bracing his weight on the edge of the table, like a man trying to steady himself against a memory that wouldn't stop shaking. "I didn't see it," he said after a long silence. "What you were doing, what you were holding together." I said nothing. He looked down, shame written across the lines of his face like a confession too long unspoken. "I thought you were just legacy weight," he added. "A line item. Someone who had been there too long. I didn't know how much would fall apart." His voice cracked not with emotion exactly, but with the fatigue of a man realizing too late the cost of arrogance. I tilted my head, not with cruelty, but with the calm clarity of someone who had already made peace with the past. "But you didn't ask, did you?" I said quietly, not accusing, just honest. He nodded, slowly. "I'm sorry." And for a brief moment, I believed him not because I needed to, but because I had nothing left to protect. And sometimes the truth reveals itself in the simplest admissions. But apology, no matter how sincere, doesn't rewrite the damage done. It doesn't rebuild broken structures or return the dignity stripped away in 5 cold sentences. It doesn't restore what was lost in silence. I appreciate that, I said, my voice steady. But this isn't about me anymore. It's about what comes next. He nodded again, more defeated now than remorseful, the weight of his own irrelevance pressing harder with each breath. I almost felt sorry for him, almost. But then I remembered the moment he announced my dismissal without warning, the way he never looked up from his script, the way I packed up my things while Madison sat at my desk pretending not to know who I was. I remembered the ache in my chest as I walked out, not just from betrayal, but from the quiet realization that I had protected something that never intended to protect me back. And just like that, the sympathy passed. Some lessons must be lived to be learned. Later that evening, I received a message from Ashcroft's board. Richard would be stepping down from his advisory role, effective immediately. The official line was, "Personal transition," a gentle euphemism wrapped around a hard truth, but we all knew he wasn't stepping down. He was being phased out. And the final note? He'd been offered a placement at one of our remote satellite offices, a junior consulting role, reporting to someone half his age, with no strategic authority, no direct reports, and no audience. The same man who once told me I was overpaid for what I did, now being offered a fraction of his former salary to do almost nothing at all. I didn't laugh, I didn't gloat, but I did allow myself one quiet moment, just me, in my office, holding the letter he once handed me, the one announcing my salary reduction. I read it one last time, and then I fed it, piece by piece, into the shredder. Not in anger, in release. That chapter was closed. But the story wasn't over, because this had never just been about Richard. It was about every woman who had been told she was too soft to lead, too old to matter, too expensive to keep around. It was about the quiet professionals whose value was measured in the shadows, not in sound bites. And most of all, it was about proving that some of us were never waiting for revenge. We were simply waiting to be seen. I used to think legacy was something written in retirement speeches or etched into polished plaques that hung outside corner offices, words chosen by others, carefully curated, sanitized, and shortened to fit beneath a corporate logo. For a long time, I believed that to leave something behind, I had to stay long enough to be honored or loud enough to be remembered. But now, I know better. Legacy isn't what they write about you after you're gone. It's what stays standing after you've chosen to walk away. At Ashcroft Bray, I didn't chase titles or push for public praise. I did the work I believed in. I mentored, I built, I repaired, and somewhere along the way, I realized that my presence no longer needed permission. I had stopped asking to matter. I created space for those who had spent too long waiting for recognition, for opportunity, for someone to finally see past their age, their quiet strength, their lived experience. I opened doors that had once been closed to me, not by kicking them down, but by holding them open for others to step through. And in doing so, I discovered something I had never expected to find again. Peace is not the quiet resignation of surrender, but the steady rhythm of purpose. Second Bloom, the leadership initiative I'd started almost as an afterthought, grew into a movement. Women who had once been told they were past their prime began leading departments, launching initiatives, mentoring others. The ripple effects were undeniable, and in the hum of that growth, I saw pieces of myself reflected back older, wiser, unafraid to start again. I kept my weekly office hours, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The young ones came in, sometimes unsure, often unheard, and I listened not just to their ambitions, but to their fears. I helped them build not just resumes, but resilience. And in that quiet exchange of wisdom, I watched something beautiful take root, a new kind of leadership, one grounded in presence instead of performance. One day, I received a letter, handwritten, folded neatly into an envelope slipped onto my desk. It wasn't from a board member or an executive. It was from a part-time assistant in her early 40s who had just returned to work after caring for her aging parents. She wrote, "Thank you for reminding me that experience is an asset, not a burden. That strength isn't always loud, and that sometimes the most powerful leaders are the ones who never needed a spotlight to shine." I read it 3 times before I placed it in a drawer I now keep for moments like that. Not trophies, not reminders of victory, but proof. Proof that the work mattered. that I mattered, and that what I had built could live on quietly, purposefully, unshaken by trends or titles. As for Richard, last I heard, he took the offer in Arizona, modest advisory role at a remote field office. No team, no influence, just a nameplate and the long, slow ache of reflection. I don't think of him often, and when I do, it's not with anger, it's with clarity. He was never the villain, he was the lesson, a necessary one. Some people rise by stepping on others, but the ones who last, they build platforms under everyone they lift. That's what legacy is. Not what you take with you when you leave, but what you leave behind that still breathes when you're gone. Now, when I walk into a room, I don't carry fear that I'll be overlooked. I carry presence, sharpened like a weapon, but anchored like a root. And presence, I've learned, isn't earned by speaking the loudest. It's earned by standing your ground, by knowing who you are, and by never allowing anyone else to shrink it for their comfort. So if you're out there, someone who's been dismissed, replaced, or told that your best years are behind you, I want you to hear this clearly. Your story isn't over. You are not invisible. You are not obsolete. And your value has nothing to do with who sees it. It lives in what you've built, in what still stands, because you stood for it. There was a time long before the layoffs, the cancer, the cold conference room announcement when I believed the only dignified way to leave was quietly, to slip out without a fuss, to bow with grace and never ask for acknowledgement. I thought strength meant silence, and that dignity came from enduring in the background, unseen but essential. But I see now that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do isn't to disappear quietly, but to speak clearly and calmly without apology. Because when they tried to erase me, they didn't just underestimate my resilience, they misunderstood my presence. And what I've learned, what I want you to remember, is that there is no expiration date on value. There is no statute of limitations on worth. You don't have to stay loyal to something just because you helped build it. And walking away doesn't mean you failed it. Maybe the moment you finally begin, the moment you stop shrinking, the moment you realize that the systems you protected, the people you lifted, and the integrity you carried matter more than any position they tried to take from you. I didn't have to destroy anyone to reclaim my strength. I simply removed myself and let truth, time, and gravity do what they do best. What happened to Richard wasn't revenge. It was consequence. And what happened to me, that was growth. Now, when I walk into a room, I don't worry whether I'll be seen. I know who I am. Not because of a title on a door, but because of what still stands: systems that function, teams that thrive, people who believe they are enough because someone finally looked them in the eye and said, "You are." Legacy, I've learned, isn't about who remembers your name. It's about what lives on because of how you showed up, how you stood your ground, and how you left space better than you found it. So if you're holding on to silence, if you've been made to feel invisible, if someone has tried to define your worth in numbers or age or relevance, please hear this. Your story is not over. You are not done. You are not replaceable. You are the proof that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands still and refuses to be erased. And now, maybe it's your turn. Have you ever been dismissed, overlooked, or replaced by someone who never understood your worth? What did you do next? If you're ready, drop your story in the comments below because someone else might need to read it today. And together, we can build a legacy they can't ignore.